Imagine living with a disease like hemophilia. You discover there's a new treatment that cures it, but celebration ends in dismay. Due to high cost, big pharma companies decided to stop offering them. There is a cure, but not for you. One of the great challenges with these new treatments for certain diseases is that they can't be created in large quantities. Each therapy is more individualized. It needs special equipment to process. It's easier for biopharma companies to treat diseases that more people have, like cancer or diabetes. Pfizer announced that they were no longer producing a treatment for hemophilia because the demand was limited. And sadly, those who were being helped will now have to seek other treatments. But there is one terminal disease no one can heal except for our God, who provided the cure. The cost was the cross of Christ, and by his wounds we are healed. Welcome to Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, sharing the great story that's all about Jesus. We're in a series called The Best of 2025, the surprising story of amazing grace. And we're going to pick up the story of John Newton again today. It's now the mid-1700s. At this point, he's still a teenager, soon to be living the life of a sailor. And although his late mother had been a devout Christian, Newton's drifting away from the faith was already in motion, soon to be a complete, total rejection of the Christian faith. Helping us tell that story today is Dr. Bruce Hindmarsh, who co-wrote and helped produce the film Amazing Grace, along with Charles Morris. And really, it's Newton's unlikely story that drives the narrative.
So what got us interested in telling the story, again, we wrote a book, and we made a film, and we wanted to tell this story again because 2023 was 250 years of Amazing Grace. So it's time to pause, it's time to celebrate, it's time to look back. And so we made a documentary film with all these beautiful reconstructions, dramatizations to tell the story, because a good documentary is driven by a question. And the question that drove us is, how did this man come to write this song?
Bruce Hindmarsh will be back in a moment to tell more of the story, which right now feels so incredibly relevant. Our world is having a moment. Here in the global West, there's a renewed interest in spiritual things, and this is a moment that calls for gospel clarity. It's not enough just to be interested and open to Christian messages. Grace has saving power when it's the grace that comes from Jesus Christ, on the basis of a person's faith in his life, death, resurrection, his atonement made for sinners who cannot save themselves. That is grace, and only Christ can give it. And it is amazing. That's the ultimate message of the film, Amazing Grace, The Untold Story. It's Haven's first ever feature film, a docudrama. And I'll be honest, we had no idea how hard it is to make a movie, but the Lord provided for top-level actors. Kappa Studios, which is run by Christian believers and handles The Chosen, they stepped in to do the editing and post-production. We're thrilled to share the final product with you. And we have Amazing Grace, The Untold Story, on DVD as our thanks for your tax-deductible year-end gift to Haven. And your generosity is greatly needed with the end of 2025 tomorrow. So don't hesitate. You can call us right now at 865-HAVEN, 865-HAVEN, or you can give online at haventoday.org, haventoday.org. Don't forget to ask for the Amazing Grace DVD. And now we'll hear a program that aired a few months ago. It's one of our favorites for this year. This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen. Yesterday, Dr. Bruce Hindmarsh joined me and was telling the story of Newton's early life, how he'd lost his mother, had a harsh upbringing, how he fell in love as a teenager, but then was sent off to sea where his faith was essentially shipwrecked. And we'll pick up that conversation where we left off. And so here we have this man the young man, who is going to become the great pastor, the great hymn writer, John Newton. And his life has gone from tragedy to backsliding to increasing depravity and disobedience, and it's like he just can't seem to reform himself. He just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and his situation keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I think a lot of parents can probably resonate with, seeing someone that you love make bad choice after bad choice, and it just keeps getting worse. Is it possible that God's grace could actually touch someone's life? And at this point, I don't know that John Newton's father was thinking in those categories, but certainly we reading his story can sort of impute our own lives and our hearts and our hurts and our relationships, and kind of see modern day versions of that kind of thing, can't we?
No, I'm glad you said that. When Craig and I were writing this story, we thought this is a parable. It's a parable of all of our lives. It's a parable of what it is, parents that lose their children, literally, they lose hold of their children. They wonder what's happening. Will they ever come back? And to this point, I think we still, as readers, as viewers of the film, as those who are witnessing his story, at this point, I think we still kind of sympathize with him.
Mm-hmm.
We're aware some awful things have happened to him. Of
Yeah.
course, he's an impetuous adolescent. He makes bad choices, but an awful lot of terrible things have happened to him.
Yeah, he's more victim than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think we can identify with that. Again, it's a parable of our lives. We don't get very far through life before we get knocked sideways. Bad things happen. And for this, we need the grace of God. We need his mercy. We hope that there's a God who will pursue us with his grace and his kindness and find us and heal us and save us. I think the next part of the story becomes even darker and it's harder.
Yes.
It's harder to identify with because they're at Madeira. They're on the way around the western coast of Africa, heading towards West Africa. And he wakes up suddenly. He finds out that there's another trading ship, a slave ship actually nearby, and that there's a possibility of trading and getting out of the Navy and being traded for one of the sailors that they want to get rid of on this slave ship.
Yeah.
And so he's eager to do this. And it's not because he wants to be in the slave trade. He just wants out of the Navy. This is his ticket out of the Navy. And as we try to picture it in the film, as he's descending the ladder from the one ship into the other, he's descending into the heart of darkness, into the belly of the beast. That descent of that ladder from the ship is symbolic of his descent into a very dark world.
And what a contrast. He thinks he's saving himself. And in fact, he's buying himself a ticket into hell on earth.
I gradually abandoned my Christian commitments. I became an infidel, a free thinker, and a libertine. My struggles between sin and conscience were often repeated. Every relapse sunk me into still greater depths of wickedness. I soon lost all sense of religion.
We just had to run a little clip from the film there. Such a recognizable voice. John Rhys Davies playing the older Newton, looking back on his life with so much regret. But that regret went far beyond what we just heard, because soon Newton would also be entering the slave system itself, one of the most wicked institutions ever created, and especially at this point in the 1700s.
And this is the point at which we should remind people that the slave system is operating in the background for most Europeans.
Yes.
And in the 18th century, there's a whole system where goods are come from Europe, they come from Britain, and are sold and traded down the West African coast for slaves that originate sometimes deep inside Africa in terms of an internal slave system and trading system. They're traded to the coast. They're traded onto these ships. They're collected on these ships. And it's terrible overcrowding. It's terrible conditions on board these ships. And they're gathered like commodities. They're given numbers rather than names. Many of them die while they're being traded in these subtropical waters where disease can often be rife on these ships. And then they make the middle passage from West Africa across the Atlantic, following the trade winds and the currents, to the West Indies and to the Americas, where these slaves will enter into the plantation system. The plantation system required a huge
Right.
fund of fungible labor. They needed labor, and the conditions were, if anything, worse. Many of these slaves didn't last more than about 3 years
Mm.
before they were worked to death. Cotton, coffee, sugar, and so on. And then those commodities are brought back to Britain. It's like a triangular slave system. So when people in England put sugar in their Wedgwood china teacups and stir it into their teacups, they aren't necessarily aware of this long and bloody supply chain that has
Yeah.
brought that sugar to their shores. And it's like today, we might worry today, what is it today that I don't see, that what systems am I involved in, even unwittingly as a consumer, in terms of systems that are built on the back of a kind of oppression. Well, this was brutal in the 18th century, and it's that world into which he drops, and he'll begin working in the slave trade.
Yeah.
And he thinks he's maybe got it made, and he maybe this is his way to make a fortune.
Right.
And he meets a man on board this ship as they're trading who is setting up a new slave warehouse. They called these factories
Yeah.
where they would collect the slaves on the coast. He's setting up a new one on Plantain Island near Sierra Leone. And he thinks, oh, I'll go along with this man, Evans, and I'll make my fortune onshore as an African slave trader. Instead, he gets a tropical fever. It's probably malaria. He becomes quite sick. Evans is in business with his mistress, Pi, an African princess, and she ends up abusing Newton. He said he became the servant of slaves.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
ends up for a while himself in chains. He ends up laboring, destitute. And it's only that the slaves themselves have pity on him and feed him that he survives. This is kind of the low point of his own journey,
Yeah.
where he should have died alone,
Yeah.
forgotten, far from home, and desperate.
Yeah.
And this is really the kind of low point of his story. And his father, despite the distance between father and son, his father was looking out for him, and ships that were going down to the west coast of Africa. He said, "Look out for my son.
Right.
See if you can find my son." And so eventually, there's a ship called the Greyhound that comes by. It's not a slave ship, and word comes that somebody's looking for Newton. And so after maybe 18 months, 2 years in Africa, he comes on board this ship and he has passage back to
Yeah.
England. And so they're making the journey. It's the same journey as those slave ships would make, even though this wasn't a slave ship. And they probably should have stopped somewhere in subtropical, tropical Africa and have refitted the ropes and the sheets, the sails and so on, and they didn't. They were going to make one big go of it, one big arcing journey back without stopping around the trade winds and so on, past the coast of
Yeah.
Brazil, up the coast of North America to Newfoundland, and then make a real run for it back toward Ireland. And in the winter of 1748, on March 21st, in the middle of the North Atlantic, between Newfoundland and Ireland, there's a severe North Atlantic storm. And Newton, what's going on inside him?
Yeah.
He's been rescued. He's on his way back. He's a bit bored on the ship. He alludes to various ways to sort of misbehavior and sinful attitudes and sexual misconduct and other things that he's been involved in. But he picks up a Bible, something to read.
Yep.
He picks up Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, and he wonders what are the consequences if this is true. But then he closes the book and he thinks, no, I've made my decision. I've made my bed. I've got to sleep in it. I've got to live with this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then comes this storm. He's woken in the middle of the night. The ship is filling fast with water. The waves are mountains high. And a man goes up from the hold of the ship before him up the ladder and is swept overboard. And it's absolutely brutal. The front starboard side of the ship is damaged. They have to keep the bow up out of the water, which puts them off course. It's not clear at all they're going to survive the night. The ship is taking on water fast, and it's only the fact that their cargo was lighter than water, that it was wood and
Yes.
wax and other kinds of products that weren't too heavy, that allowed them to survive the storm, to bail, to pump, to patch. But during the long night, he's tied to the ship.
By a rope. Yes. Yeah.
He's tied by a rope. He's piloting the ship. And he says, if this will not do, then the Lord have mercy.
Hmm.
And it's like he's praying.
Yeah.
And he realizes all the agonies of a repressed conscience flood back. And it goes, how can there possibly be mercy for me?
Yeah.
And he's looking in the face of death. And he's wondering, how on earth could there be mercy for me? Oh God, if this will not do, have mercy.
Hmm.
And the captain is despairing. A lot of the people on board are despairing. And he makes it somehow through. They make it through. But then, if that's the crisis, the acute point of a crisis, March 21st, 1748, there's still several weeks when it's not clear that they'll survive.
Right.
Because they're limping along with a ship out of repair, barely any propulsion. They're depending on fair winds, and they don't have much water. They don't have much food left. It's all been damaged.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that they will survive. So he has time to think. And he will always look back on March 21st as the beginning, he said, not so much of me turning to God, but God turning to me, God getting my attention.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that, okay, one and done, I've had a big conversion, it's all good now. But he says that was the moment when he was no longer an infidel, which is the 18th century word for saying, there is a God.
Yeah.
There is a God who answers prayer.
Yeah.
What am I to do with that?
Yeah.
And he's not an atheist. He's not an agnostic. He's going, there is a God. What does this now require of me?
Yeah.
And he becomes, as they would say in this period, a serious Christian. He wants to be serious about it. And when they at length reach Ireland, he goes to church and he makes vows.
Yeah.
I will be a Christian.
Yeah.
I will be a serious Christian. This is much more serious now, and I need to live the Christian faith.
And for me, this is a fascinating kind of juncture in the story and in his journey, because especially I think as believers, and things like the prodigal son, the story of the parable, prodigal son, things like that come to mind, and we think it's kind of a clean pathway to redemption.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, great. He being on Plantain Island, that's like, living with the pigs and eating the scraps, but then he's rescued and now he's coming home to his father. All will be well.
Yes, that's the story we want.
Well, it feels, but and in a sense, from the really high altitude view, that's precisely what God is doing. But in the weeds, it's so much more messy and confusing, and that rings true to the reality that all of us live in, I think, with the ones that we love. And maybe even self-identify in our own journey, that we just take little steps, often little steps closer to Jesus, and it just takes time. A lot of the time it takes time.
Yes, exactly. And when he would later write about this, he wanted people to understand that it wasn't, if you like, a V-shaped conversion. It was U-shaped and had quite a flat U.
Yeah.
Like there was a sense in which he just knew it was, like he said, it wasn't like the bright noonday brightness of who God is, and it was more like he said, the faint dawning of the day, a faint twilight. The light slowly came into his life.
The light slowly came into his life. We'll pause the conversation here, and we'll pick up the story next time, and we'll grapple with one of the most confusing parts of Newton's story, that as a new professing Christian, he'd go on to captain several slave ships himself. How could a Christian continue to do such a thing? It's hard to grapple with, but we know this. John Newton would eventually despise all that he'd done, the evil he'd been complicit in. It would weigh on him throughout his life, and yet the Lord would redeem that in a remarkable way. In his later years, Newton openly shared about the slave trade. He shocked England's society, but helped hasten the end of the slave trade. And that's one of the reasons I was so moved by this film. I've seen others have a similar reaction. At an early screening of the film, we had some audience feedback. Here's what the first person who spoke up in the film screening had to say.
To be able to show that a wicked thing such as slavery can find, redemption. It just causes us to remember that, no matter what sin we have in our hearts, those that are disclosed and undisclosed, it's no match for God's grace. It can be forgiven. It can be redeemed, And so, yeah, I thought it was really beautiful, profound. I love seeing everybody's tears because, it just means we're profoundly moved, right? And it's great.
This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and I want to invite you to be profoundly moved as well by Amazing Grace, the Untold Story. This docudrama offers a unique way to share what the grace of Jesus Christ can do in a person's life. And if he can do it in the life of a man like John Newton, he can surely do it in anyone's life. And I love that there's this evangelistic aspect to the film as well, so I urge you to get your copy. Right now, the best place to get it is through Haven Today, Amazing Grace, the Untold Story on DVD. And with December 31st coming tomorrow, we really need your help to close the remaining financial gap. There is very little time left if you delay, but there's more than enough if you act today. The need is real, but your help will make a real difference and will help ensure we can continue offering Christ-centered teaching throughout 2026. We're asking the Lord to help us so that we don't have to make difficult financial decisions, scale back ministry in any way. We don't want to, especially at a time like this when spiritual hunger is rising all around us. And so, as God has used this ministry in your life, would you consider responding today and being a blessing to others? Your gift keeps that message, the All About Jesus message, on the air. And as you make your tax-deductible gift, please be sure to ask for Amazing Grace, the Untold Story on DVD. 865-HAVEN is the number to call, 865-HAVEN, or you can go online to haventoday.org, haventoday.org. I'm David Wollen. Won't you come back again next time? We'll be keeping it all about Jesus. It's the great story here on Haven Today.